Good evening, Art History One. I hope you are doing fantastically well. And greetings from Rome and the Colosseum, one of the world's great cities that shows up. As you can see, I've got my Italian designer clothes. I'm ready to go out as the clubs come up in Rome, which is generally considered one of the great party cities in the world for clubbing, for food, and for ancient Roman monuments. We're actually going to spend today exploring the early history of ancient Rome and the impacts on the arts. And so let me share my screen so you can see what we're doing. See, the sun is setting nicely behind me. Here's ancient Rome. You can see our dates from ancient Rome start off at about 400 BCE, but then finally we get into the Common Era. Remember, the Common Era would traditionally have been seen as AD before, but to keep the Christian references out, we're going to use CE for the Common Era, even though the dates are the same. The Romans are fantastic, particularly with architecture, which we'll see in our next class. The rest of Roman art, while fantastic, is really borrowing some of the many elements from Greek art that we saw earlier. So we can talk about Roman art being Greek 2.0. And one of the great things about Rome, kind of like Greece and Egypt, this is a civilization you probably already know something about. Whether that is for most of you who have seen the movie Gladiator, there's a number of Netflix videos and shows that actually have dealt with the ancient Roman world or with the emperors. Probably most of you have heard the Emperor Nero, and we have to look at the truth behind his situation as well. So what do you already know about ancient Rome? What do you want to know? And what will you learn about ancient Rome? On this map, I want you to show you the map of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. And you can see it basically wraps around all around the Mediterranean Sea. All this area that is actually in colored is basically the Roman Empire. And Mediterranean Sea, you can see here, they basically call that our sea. They believed, even when they were a tiny little city-state, that it was their manifest destiny to go out and rule on anything the water of the Mediterranean Sea touched. And eventually, as you can see, it took them a couple hundred years, but they were able to achieve that dream and then continue into Germania, into Britannia, which is England today. Now remember, the United States also had manifest destiny. When there were only 13 colonies, we really were thinking, wouldn't it be great if we ruled everything from sea to shining sea, which of course we now do, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from New York and Washington and Miami all the way over to Los Angeles and Seattle. So we had our manifest destiny as well, which became part of our national pride and power. The Roman landscapes, like the Greek landscapes, we have a number of hills. It's a mountainous region, a very good wine growing region, not so much for wheat and some of the other materials. And so we are going to have a wine culture that's going to get established and promoted even further. And as we have gladiatorial culture, as we talked about with ancient Greece, please remember, if you can figure out a workout schedule while you're in college, it will actually help you learn better. Now, Italian Iron Age civilization before the Romans, there is a civilization there, which we will want to give a shout out and spend a moment on, and that is the Etruscans. Excuse me, when the Romans come over, and we'll talk about how the founding myth of the Romans, there's a few of them. When they come over, they are actually going to incorporate an Etruscan concept called portraiture. And so with that portraiture, as we see here, the Etruscans are the ones who invent portraiture. The Romans are going to continue on with this process, and they're going to call it verism. Verism for truth, like veritas, that is on every dollar bill that you potentially have in your wallet. They're basically going to create this portraiture, and they're going to use this for sarcophagi covers for when they get buried. Now, the Etruscans themselves are a village farming civilization that's living in this area for the better part of about 1,000 years before the Romans. And the Romans are going to intermarry with the Etruscans as they actually found the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans are one of the few interesting, kind of like the Greeks, with their multiple different narratives, or their multiple different ideas of, sorry about that, of multiple different ideas of how the founding happens. Rome has multiple different founding stories, and they semi-match up, but there's not really a conclusive history behind this. So one of the founding myths of Rome is the following. Aeneas, who is the founding ancestor of Rome, and he's a Trojan royalty. So when the Greeks city-states come together to fight the city of Troy, from the Iliad, which we saw at the beginning of Greek culture, where they take their founding myth, and ultimately the Greeks are able to win and kind of take over Troy and establish a Greek republic, or I'm sorry, a Greek empire that's based upon democracy, at least for a short bit of time. Aeneas is one of those Trojan princes that escapes and flees towards the Italian peninsula. And so basically what Rome says is, yes, Greece conquered Troy, but Troy and his ancestors in Aeneas eventually are going to conquer Greece, which they will by developing a professional army. So Aeneas, the founding ancestor of Rome and Trojan royalty, flees Troy during the Trojan War, ultimately settling amongst the Etruscans in Italy. A second foundation myth is a story of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers. They are sons of the war gods Mars and Aeneas's great-granddaughter. So again, we can line this up on the timeline. They were thrown to the wolves for fear that they may take over the kingdoms. And a she-wolf comes along and suckles them. So this is them being suckled by a she-wolf. Eventually, Romulus and Remus are fighting and are constantly brothers bickering. And Remus wants to name Rome Remus, and Romulus wants to name Rome after himself, Rome. And this is going to it relies on Romulus killing Remus, killing his own brother. Very similar to the Cain and Abel story we see later on. And so Rome gets founded and is called Rome after Romulus. This actually image of the she-wolf suckling the two twins is on the city flag of Rome today. It is their symbol. Roman emperors during the imperial period trace their lineage to a coupling between the war god Mars, the uber masculine, and Venus, god of love, the uber kind of female god. So they were the perfection of male and female that were showing up. And so this is another one of the founding myths. Coming along the lines on the right, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. The ancient lineage of the emperors really trace their lineage all the way back to these two historical gods. So now, while these founding myths kind of don't quite line up into history, all three are believed in the ancient Roman world. And they had a consistent narrative for these three. Now, as we get into the Roman Imperial period, which is the second half of the Roman Empire, we really do have to think about their Roman emperors themselves and the way they behaved. And so a couple things that shows up, and I gotta hide this here. There we go. The Roman emperors, some were ruling wisely and some were badly. So this slide is for the good, the bad, and the ugly. Julius Caesar is generally a very good Roman emperor. He creates the Roman Empire. He's a brilliant military general. He conquers France, which is actually at that point called Gaul, adding on that piece of the Mediterranean to expand the Roman Empire. Augustus is Julius Caesar's great nephew, who's the hand-picked successor for Julius Caesar after he gets assassinated. Also very good ruler, seen here in the second purple block. First Roman emperor, he creates the Roman peace, the longest period of uninterrupted Roman peace that we have. And he solves Roman issues, such as they have a drought issue. He's able to solve that as a young man. We have Caligula the bad, which you see in the red. He's a psychotic paranoid. He encourages debauchery, particularly sexual debauchery, and he wants to limit the power of the Senate, the power of the people. And then we have the truly ugly, and part of this has to do with inbreeding, as these individuals believe that they were the sons of the sun god, or son of the war god Mars, and the son of the coupling of the beauty god and the god of love in terms of Aphrodite or of Venus. They believe that in order to have more pure power blood, they would need to marry their sisters who also had pure blood, or their moms, or their aunts, or nieces and nephews. And over time in the first generation, that coupling doesn't matter that much. But after you get to 2, 3, 4 generations, it truly gets ugly. And we have a number of mental deficiencies that start to show up in the later imperial period. One of them is actually the Commodus, who literally believes, and makes everyone treat him like he's actually Hercules or Heracles reborn in the Roman world. So in ancient Rome, 400 BCE to 400 CE, why do we care? Why do we care about ancient Rome? Well, they're going to invent the dome. Actually, I should say they perfect the dome. They're going to perfect plumbing and the aqueduct system that allows for clean running water. They're going to develop the stadium by putting two of the Greek theaters together, two amphitheaters, making a stadium. They're going to create the first world's professional army, which allows them to dominate the region. They're going to create the world's first professional navy. They're going to build the road system, which is largely the basis of the highway system that we have throughout Europe today, are based upon Roman roadbeds, even today. They're going to come up with a new concept in terms of government called the Republic, which is based upon the rule of law. They're going to come up with the idea of the Orators' Pose, which we're going to see over and over, whether it's Heil Hitler that show up, whether it's peace, whether it's the papal blessing. They're going to come up with the idea of verism. Now, portraiture they borrowed from the Etruscans, but their uber portraiture that they're going to do that's highly realistic, called verism, they're actually going to show. They, along with China, are going to set up the Silk Road, exchanging gifts and trade all the way from the Eastern to the Western known world at the time. They're going to develop the first zoo. The male symbol comes from Aries. And the idea of fatherhood in being so important, being the head of the family, that is also going to be a Roman concept. But basically everything else is ancient Greece 2.0. So much so that when we look at it, the planetary names are basically based upon Greek gods. They're just changed the name. So Mercury, the messenger god closest to the sun, is Hermes. Venus is going to be the love goddess Aphrodite. Mars is going to be the war god Ares. Jupiter, the largest of the planets, is going to be Kronos, Zeus's father, also Zeus's father basically in the Roman world. 1/4 of all of our popular songs are about love, and this is a concept that the Romans are really going to start to promote that we have even into today, and another 1/3 of our songs about sex. So Venus and love develop into a philosophical concept of true romantic love. The first time we ever see that is in ancient Rome. So we can see even in the modern day 80s song. You probably know this song. So it has been said that the Romans conquered the Greeks, but Greek culture conquered the Romans. And the other thing that's going to show up within this process, as we can see, is we are going to end up again with our wine culture. And that is because the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans are going to build their culture upon ancient Greece. And they believed they were culture. They were theater. They were about academics. They were about art versus the uncultural barbarians that are the beer drinkers. And this is just really going to lead us into the modern day world where we have this Roman expansion of wine versus beer cultures. Wealthy Romans collected wine, collected vintages, had wine storehouses, very similar to the way sommeliers, which is a fancy wine collector that works at a restaurant to actually pair your wine with your food work today. The Romans pride themselves on this and knowing the different vintages. Now, the Roman expansion of wine versus barbarian beer culture even shows up in terms of the map. As you look at it, the pinkish color on the left, those are the individuals that early on are dominated by Rome. And note, the more dominated by Rome an area is, the more pink that area becomes, the more it becomes a wine culture. So we think about the great academic cultures throughout history. We think about France and like Nietzsche and the Germany within the beer culture as well. We're going to think about Italy and the Renaissance. We're going to think about these wonderful ancient Greece. Whereas when we think of the orange cultures, we think more about uncultured barbarians. When we think about Germany, outside of philosophy and kind of their contributions, major contributions to philosophy, we really are thinking much more along the lines of such things as sports, as soccer, more sports, more rural, more uncultured. And this is a tradition that comes with us. We're going to see that in the United States as well. So if you look at our US political maps, comparing our politics and alcohol consumption, the more conservative a state is based upon who they voted for in the last few elections, the more conservative a state is, the more they drink beer. So the yellow on the very bottom, those are beer drinking cultures. Note the red above it, how they almost directly overlap. The weird case being us here in Florida, or one of the weird cases. So that red on the very top that you see, those are the states that went Republican. So no, Republican states, those more conservative states, they're beer drinking cultures. The more cultured, academic, art side culture that are seen in the blue up on the top map, note almost all of them end up as wine culture that shows up in the United States of America. So there is this preference that shows up that is a derivation. So if you walk into a bar, see more people drinking wine than beer, you could probably most likely in one of these states, or at least in a more liberal area of that state. What are the similarities and differences between Greek and Roman culture? So the high point of Greek and Roman sculpture is going to be the image over here on your left, the Augustus of Porta. No, that is an emperor named Augustus, or who renames himself Augustus when he becomes the emperor. No, there is no artist's name. Again, the Romans do not value the artist. They value who it represents. So these are much more imperial propaganda than they are largely artistic kind of celebrities that show up, as in Spear Bearer, where both the artist as the first, or as both the person it represents, the first Olympic gold medal winner, as well as the artist, Polykleitos, both get celebrated. So the quote here that shows up is by Plutarch, who's a first century commentator. It says, "No gifted young man, upon seeing the Zeus of Phidias at Olympia, ever wanted to be Phidias." So a Roman individual that was gifted, looking upon a Greek sculpture, even one of the most important ones in the world, would not want to be Greek. Or upon seeing the hero at Argos, wanted to be Polykleitos. So even though Polykleitos is arguably the greatest sculptor that had ever lived, maybe outside of Phidias up until that point, no Roman man would want that. Why? That's copying. We want to do what is Roman, what is right, not as what is intellectually inferior, which they thought from the Greek civilization. Now, for us in the future, these two civilizations get so conflated that later on, we're not even going to know they're two separate civilizations. During the Renaissance, Greek and Roman civilization is just assumed all to be Roman civilization. They don't really know the differences. It's really not until later on in the 1700s where we start to tease apart the differences between Greek and Roman. That's how close the cultures are. So Greek culture really does kind of, in some ways, conquer Roman culture, as Plutarch said. Similarities and differences, as we look across here, you'll note they both contrapposto, both 1/7 body proportions for the head versus the body. They both have an athletic body, both have calm expressions. The differences, in the left one, the Augusta Porta, verism. We have realistic proportions. We have, particularly in the facial, that's what Augustus actually would have really looked like as the emperor. He has much more conservative clothing, and Jesus grows up and is born in the Roman Empire. That's why Jesus is always clothed versus seen as nude, as if what would have happened if he was born during the Greek Empire. And he's wearing both armor and a toga as a sign of imperial propaganda. Now, here's a joke from my son, who wrote this joke when he was 14, so I apologize. He also wrote up the lovely slides that you'll be seeing as we walk through, so he likes a lot of animation. So with a Greek and a Roman, we're comparing notes on which civilization was greater. There's the Greek individual and the Roman centurion soldier, the philosopher versus the warriors. The Greek philosopher here said, "We gave you the Parthenon, the birth of democracy, one of the great all-time, most wonderful, most beautiful buildings in the world." Rome said, "Well, we gave you the Pantheon, better, larger, the dome, God and humanity come together. It's a better culture." The Greek philosopher said, "Well, we were open and we talked about sex. We created sex manuals. We had an entire series where sex was readily available for those citizens." And the Roman guy, of course, and here's the response to the punchline, said, "Yes, but we taught women how to have sex." And so the whole notion here is that Rome was making fun of, and based upon my son's joke here, the Romans were pointing fun to the fact that the Greeks were boy lovers, that they were not just homosexual, but they would actually fall in love and have beauty contests with a 15 or 16-year-old boy and want to have sex and like try to couple with that individual, even for a night, for a one-night stand, when they were a 35 or 40-year-old person. And from the Roman standard of a more paternal, of a more fatherly impact, that made no sense to them at all. So they referred to the Greeks often as boy lovers, particularly the Athenians. Now, why were the Romans so concerned about it? Because the Romans were concerned with muddled family lines. Because as a society is based upon father being the family leader, the emperor outlawed, Augustus outlawed prostitutes. Nobody really cared though. Ancient Pompeii became a pleasure area where people went to be able to fornicate and have various sexual activities, various things outside of the purview of the emperor. Government officials were not allowed to have mistresses, and men being sexually penetrated. So Rome basically becomes a more conservative sex about paternity. And so a Roman soldier could have homosexual sex, but he had to be the one that was penetrating. So he had to be the one that inserted his penis in the other one. And that really was how the Romans defined it, as the male versus female role. And so for a conservative aspect, for paternity, and they said the Greeks, are they perverts or were they just sexually advanced, knowing that there's a whole gray scale of human sexuality? That's for each of you to determine. The Romans are not going to treat their women any better than the Greeks. And here's a quote that actually comes from a Roman satirist named Juvenal, where we get juvenile literature later on. I'll move this down here. The challenge of womanhood in ancient Rome is the following. There's nothing a woman won't do. Nothing is worse to endure than you, Mrs. Rich Bitch, whose visage, face, is paddled with plaster and dough in the most ridiculous manner. What lies underneath all this? A human face or an ulcer? And there's also another one that I won't show you, but also says that women have to be presentable and beautiful when they go out in the public, as it's a representation of their family. And so women have to be dressed up, and yet when they do get dressed up, they're basically seen as a human face or an ulcer. So on some level, there's this very negative aspect towards women. Remember, when paternity rules, men are going to rule like in ancient Greek civilization, and perfection is going to be for the male body. Roman art, note, will share a lot of the same features as Greek art, as we see here, for their aesthetics. They're going to have heroism. Theirs is going to be based upon dominance and power. They're going to have Roman nationalism, our first version of real nationalism that shows up across the Roman Empire. And a lot of their artwork is going to be propaganda. That's why we don't know the artist. It's only about what the artist was trying to represent for whatever historical figure they're showing. In sculpture, we're going to see belief in the daily involvement of the gods. Politics and religion are the main subjects. Remember, that's the same thing as Mesopotamia. Polyclitus idealized canon. The only difference is they're going to have realistic facial portraits, but that 1/7 head size, the contrapposto pose, the calm, the up on a pedestal. In their architecture, that's going to be their most important art form. So we'll have an entire lecture on how their architecture is different in our next lecture. Concrete structure decorated with marble. So not just made with marble, which is highly breakable. That's why Roman architecture still stands today. And if you go to ancient Greece, you'll see mostly rubble that they're trying to repair. They emphasize open spaces, domes, arches, which is very different than the closed, claustrophobic Doric columns in particular in ancient Greek culture. And everything is going to be based upon mathematical perfection. Not how your eye sees, but if the math says something looks the way it should look, they will use the math over the optics.
I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. Study art history or choose a different career. Yes, 100 of the greatest artworks of all time.
So here as we look at this, and thank you to our Godfather here, Mr. Brando, for the Godfather, artworks that change the world. Here's the message. On the left is generally how we see these artists and these artworks. That's the Augustus of Prima Porta. On the right is actually the gaudy coloration it actually would have been seen in. So we often see these very white, bland artworks and artifacts. Note that they're just completely wrong in almost every capacity. It would have been that gaudy, right hand, red and blue and white version, as if it's wearing an American flag, or in this case, the Roman flag. Now, the individual represents is Augustus, and he is one of the great leaders in Roman history because of what he's able to do, particularly with military campaigns. He is the individual that conquers Egypt and Spain. He regains the standards. Those are those long metal poles that have the eagle on the top of it. Remember, our flag basically generally has, our flagpole often has an eagle. And when things are not going well in our country, we drop it to half mast. That comes out of the Roman tradition, which still, remember, comes out of the Hammurabi, the god handing you a metal rod for right to rule. He regains those standards from Julius Caesar's only loss, and Julius Caesar is a military hero and genius in Germania. He unifies the Roman Empire, eventually by defeating both Mark Antony and the military when the Roman Empire falls apart into three. He's the reunifier. He creates the Pax Romana, the longest period in European of uninterrupted peace. And the month of August is named after him. It comes from Augustus because many of the things that he did actually showed up in the month of August. Before this, the month of August was called Saturnus. So basically, they renamed a month for a god with a person that was still living. So it's a pretty impressive feat. Note on the armor, he's also claiming, because it's propaganda, on the armor itself, you will see right there is the standard with the eagle being handed back from Germania to Augustus, who's going to then march it in this sculpturesque way to show what a military hero is as he's wearing armor. Note he wears both armor and a toga. Do you remember who wears a toga in ancient Greek and early Roman civilization? That's correct. So he's a military hero with the armor, but at the same time, he's a philosopher. He's a bright individual. And note the bright red color that actually shows up. And some people argue that that bright red color would have actually been done in purple, the royal color. Only the highest individuals and the emperor were allowed to wear purple because it was so rare. They had to collect it from a shell and only came ashore once every 2 years off the coast of Italy. And so this is an artwork that changes the world. Note the posture that's showing up, which we are going to see called the Orator's gesture, is going to impact all sorts of speaking gestures in the future. Now here's TEDx, where it goes a little bit through more about the history of Augustus and talking about the Roman Empire at the time period.
His reign marked the beginning of one of history's greatest empires and the end of one of its first republics. Was Rome's first emperor a visionary leader who guaranteed his civilization's place in history, or a tyrant who destroyed its core values? Find out in History versus Augustus.
Order. The defendant today is Gaius Octavius?
Gaius
Augustus.
Julius Caesar.
Do we have the wrong guy?
No, Your Honor. Gaius Octavius, born in 63 BCE, was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. He became Gaius Julius Caesar upon being named his great-uncle's adoptive son and heir, and he gained the title Augustus in 27 BCE, when the Senate granted him additional honors.
No, this is during the
When he
life of Jesus
established
now.
sole authority and became emperor of Rome.
Is that bad? Didn't every place have some king or emperor back then?
Actually, Your Honor, the Roman people had overthrown their kings centuries before to establish a republic, a government meant to serve the people, not the privilege of a ruling family. And it was Octavius who destroyed this tradition. Octavius was a model public servant. At 16, he was elected to the College of Pontiffs that supervised religious worship. He fought for Rome in Hispania alongside his great-uncle Caesar, and took up the responsibility of avenging Caesar's death when the corrupt oligarchs in the Senate betrayed and murdered him. Caesar had been a power-hungry tyrant who tried to make himself a king while consorting with his Egyptian queen Cleopatra. After his death, Octavius joined his general Mark Antony in starting a civil war that tore Rome apart, then stabbed his ally in the back to increase his own power. Antony was a fool. He waged a disastrous campaign in Parthia and plotted to turn Roman territories into personal kingdoms for himself and Cleopatra.
Isn't that what Caesar had been accused of?
Well,
So Octavius destroyed Antony for trying to become a king and then became one himself?
that's right. You can see the megalomania even in his adopted titles, the illustrious one. That was a religious honorific. And Augustus didn't seek power for his own sake. As winner of the Civil War and commander of the most troops, it was his duty to restore law and order to Rome so that other factions didn't continue fighting. He didn't restore the law, he made it subordinate to him. Not true. Augustus worked to restore the Senate's prestige, improved food security for the lower classes, and relinquished control of the army when he resigned his consul post. Mere optics. He used his military influence and personal wealth to stack the Senate in his favor, while retaining the powers of a tribune and the right to celebrate military triumphs. He kept control of provinces with the most legions, and if that wasn't enough, he assumed the consul position twice more to promote his grandchildren. He was clearly trying to establish a dynasty.
But what did he do with all that power?
Glad you asked, Your Honor. Augustus's accomplishments were almost too many to name. He established consistent taxation for all provinces, ending private exploitation by local tax officials. He personally financed a network of roads and employed couriers so news and troops could travel easily throughout the realm. And it was under Augustus that many of Rome's famous public buildings were constructed. The writers of the time were nearly unanimous in praising his rule. Did the writers have any other choice? Augustus exiled plenty of people on vague charges, including Ovid, one of Rome's greatest poets. And you forgot to mention the intrusive laws regarding citizens' personal lives, punishing adultery, restricting marriage between social classes, even penalties for remaining unmarried. He was trying to improve the citizenry and instill discipline, and he succeeded. His legacy speaks for itself. 40 years of internal stability, a professional army that expanded Rome's frontiers in all directions, and a government still remembered as a model of civic virtue. His legacy was an empire that would go on to wage endless conquest until it collapsed, and a tradition of military autocracy. Anytime a dictator in a general's uniform commits atrocities while claiming to act on behalf of the people, we have Augustus Caesar to thank.
So you're saying Augustus was a good emperor, and you're saying there's no such thing.
We're used to celebrating historical leaders for their achievements and victories, but to ask whether an individual should have such power in the first place is to put history itself on trial. Check out this playlist for more episodes of our History Versus series, where we put famous figures like Cleopatra, Vladimir Lenin, and Genghis Khan on trial.
And so as you can see, the situation is actually very complicated. As these videos say, it's very complicated because what is the truth? Yes, the defense made all the truthful arguments that he done some wonderful things with power, but he probably was trying to reinstate himself as the king and overthrow the republic, even though he wanted the republic still to be there, but more as a checks and balance. Now that is wonderful if you are a good, willing, wonderful dictator. In fact, it's what Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates all said, that the best form of government was an individual dictator that had the will of the people. That very much is what Augustus is trying to do. The problem is, if his sons that he installs don't have that same belief, you can end up with some terrible dictatorships. And that's ultimately what's going to happen within the Roman Empire. So if we look at this particular portrait, now that we know a little bit more about Augustus, you'll note at the very top, the verism, that is actually his real picture. That is his portrait. It's called verism. He's holding, on the left-hand side, the Roman metal standard symbolizing power to rule from the gods. Oftentimes that has an eagle on top of it, and it's where our flagpole comes from. He's got a muscular body, an armor for military and his accomplishments, toga for philosophers and showing his intelligence. He's carrying the lost Roman standard returned to Augustus from Germania. Remember, and the people that were Julius Caesar fans, which is the general population, loved Julius Caesar. So now he's basically coming back holding the staff that Julius Caesar loved, saying, look, I'm even better than Caesar. His feet are still up on a platform showing his power. And note, he's got Cupid tucking at his little, the bottom of his toga, symbolizing his god parentage. Remember, because they are both sons of Venus, Cupid is the son of Venus. So it'd be like big brother trying to play with little brother. So this is an artwork that very much changes the world. And of course, the one we still have to deal with is that orator's pose, the gesture of the hand gesture. That orator's pose is going to show up all throughout history. Note, we have it in the Augustus Suprema Porta. Jesus has that hand gesture for blessing. It's the papal blessing all the way to today. Hitler is going to rip it off for Heil Hitler. And John Lennon and others in the peace movement are going to use this as a peace gesture. So it's something that's going to show up a lot throughout history. And here we go. The artist's name is not known throughout history that made any of these, but we have the emperors behaving, as we saw earlier in the slides, the good, the bad, the ugly. The Roman emperors are also going to come up with verism in coinage. And so these are the various coins that each Roman emperor created, which is a self-portrait profile image of every one of them, so everyone would know what the emperor looked like. It's a way of aggrandizing themselves. Now, going back to the story that we have with both Julius Caesar and Augustus, we have the story that shows up with Cleopatra. And so the myth of history. Cleopatra was not necessarily a beautiful woman using her sexual wiles to woo two of the most powerful men in history. She was actually a brilliant, talking military strategy and speaking at least 5 different languages. So the image of Elizabeth Taylor all the way on the right doesn't line up with the portraits that we actually have of her. So if you look at her coinage, you can see she's got that crooked nose that we see right here in her coinage. We have busts of her that also show that crooked nose. And so we actually have a reproduction of by forensic psychologists or forensic archaeologists that actually made this image showing what she would have looked like. So she was more of a powerhouse, an intellectual equal of men than a beautiful woman using her sexual wiles to lure men. So a totally inappropriate. Ooh, there we go. Come on. Wait, try to get this back. Here we go. A totally inappropriate but historically accurate joke. If you don't know, Cleopatra committed suicide by allowing a snake to bite her. And so the thing that shows up within this, Cleopatra, she has the nicest asps. And so often they'll show that from a butt image. So that was an image that showed up. She was ridiculed in the ancient because they would call her a slut. They basically were doing slut shaming with her because they were trying to make her seem so terrible that it wasn't her brains that attracted the emperors to her, but it really was her beauty and her sexual, that she was willing to do things and have sex with entire army commanders. None of that could be further from the truth. It was in her intellect. Now, Augustus, as we're still on that period in Roman history, where we go from the transition from the Republic to the Empire, this is the altar of Augustan peace. It was commissioned by the Senate to commemorate Augustus as establishing the longest peace in European history, which sadly is only 150 years. So from the time that Augustus died, there was not another war in all of Europe for about 130 years. So 20 years for his own life, and then 130 years afterwards. So 150 years. As sad as that is the longest period of uninterrupted peace in all of European history. There are a couple panels that are actually very important. The Roman peace has helped the bounty and fertility of Mother Earth. That's basically the explanation, the message that goes behind this particular this altar. And so here we have see Mother Earth nurturing the Roman twins. Remember those Roman twins, Romulus and Remus. Rome has domination over the winds and seas, as you can see with the winds and the seas floating around, with the dolphin on the right-hand side and the swan on the left. You can see that Rome has domination over land and land winds. That's over on the left as well. Mother Earth nurturing the Roman twins. And the flowers show that Rome has rule over all seasons because there are different flowers that are growing from all the different seasons from the Roman growing cycle. Here's what it would have looked like when it was painted. And so here's Romulus and Remus, again, being suckled by the she-wolf, which becomes the symbol of all of Rome. And it would have been brightly colored like we've seen before. So not that white color, which is wiped off. Okay, let's get through this part. All right. As we think about Roman art, and we'll be looking at architecture as well, we could do a warm-up activity where we challenge the A to Z to think of an artwork, a personality, an aesthetic, an invention from each letter of the alphabet about ancient Rome. And that we'd give you 10 minutes for that. And also the other thing is, now that we are right at midterm or right after midterm, stress often sets in for students. And so there are a number of ways of managing stress. I would like to, in this week's, your video is actually all on managing stress that you'll have a quiz question about. And it could be the idea of deep breathing, could be yoga, could be exercise, could be mindfulness, learn how to eat a little bit healthier will help you actually manage stress within the process. Sometimes you just have to take a break, and breaks are okay provided that you are actually getting your work done. And so we do need to think about ways of managing our stress. I manage my stress by going out and playing with my kids. I like watching Netflix comedies in the background where I can actually hear jokes. I like to actually go out and play basketball. So I have figured out my managing stress activities. Each of you will need to figure out your own as well. And then that will be it for this. So the next time we see each other, we will actually be talking specifically about the great Roman artwork or art form over all time, which is going to be architecture, which is going to dominate and give us such things like the birth of the stadium and the Colosseum, which are just amazing that shows up here. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.